There's a peculiar cruelty in believing you've won while the world quietly watches you set the stage for your own undoing. What happens when a man tries to shame his ex-wife at the city's most high-profile event? Vincent Aldridge believed he had won it all, a younger woman on his arm, and his ordinary ex-wife Amelia buried in the past. He flaunted his upgraded life at the luminous Empire Tower Gala, expecting admiration from all. But he made a fatal misjudgment. He never imagined the woman he had discarded would return, not broken, but reborn. A tale of betrayal, revenge, and transformation so stunning, it shook the city to its core. The Empire Tower's grand ballroom shimmered like a galaxy all its own, a universe where wealth and influence swirled in a seductive, star-like orbit. Chandeliers hung like frozen cascades of light, scattering brilliance across the city's power players. The air was thick with the scent of designer perfumes and even more costly ambitions. The room hummed with murmured deals that could spark empires or ruin reputations. Tonight was the annual Unity Children's Benefit Gala, the crown jewel of the social calendar. To be seen here wasn't optional, it was vital. And no one grasped that better than Vincent Aldridge. Vincent, with his salt and pepper hair slicked to polished perfection and his custom tuxedo fitting like second skin, surveyed the ballroom like a monarch observing his dominion. One hand rested firmly on the slender back of a far younger woman, her name, Delilah Monroe. The press often labeled her his girlfriend. Vincent preferred upgrade. With a crimson gown sculpted to a surgically curated figure and a laugh that rang too loud and too forced, Delilah was a walking, breathing prize. Everything Amelia had never been. "Isn't this amazing, Vinny?" Delilah cooed, gripping his arm as she caught sight of a high-profile senator across the room. "Everyone's here," Vincent responded, his voice coated with the kind of entitlement only the relentlessly successful carry. He lifted his champagne flute and scanned the room, analyzing, cataloging. Even when still, he was networking. Every handshake, a seed planted. Every smile, a calculated exchange. This wasn't a celebration, it was a battlefield. His eyes locked onto a target, Gregory Wells, a major player he needed to hook for his next hedge fund launch. "Excuse me, darling," he murmured to Delilah, his grin barely stretching across his face. "Duty calls." "Work calls," Delilah pouted dramatically, batting her lashes. "Don't be too long. I feel totally naked without you." Vincent's smile barely curved. "You're never naked, darling, not with that necklace," he said, gesturing to the cascading diamonds around her neck. It had once been a treasured Aldridge family heirloom, something he had insisted Amelia return during their bitter divorce. Now it sparkled on Delilah's collarbone, a petty but satisfying victory. As he wove through the crowd like a shark slicing through water, Vincent felt an undeniable thrill. Life wasn't just good, it was exceptional. He had walked away from 15 years of a tedious, monotonous marriage and come out sharper, leaner, freer. Amelia, with her measured intellect, understated wardrobe, and preference for novels over nightlife, had become dead weight. In his mind, he was a racehorse, unfairly yoked to a cart horse. He recalled their final argument, an ugly, lopsided exchange. He had sneered at her across their granite kitchen island and said, "You're just plain Amelia." The words had slid out with the venom he had long practiced. "You have no drive, no ambition. You're fine with just existing." He had expected a meltdown, a teary breakdown, some kind of performance. Instead, she had met his eyes with unsettling calm. "You're right, Vincent," she had said, voice quiet and clear. "I am content. I'm just not content to be with you anymore." That memory still flicked at him. Not as guilt, but irritation. Her refusal to react, to beg or cry, had undercut his ego. It was as if she had let go of him long before he ever packed a suitcase. Their divorce had wrapped 6 months ago. He had been, by his own measure, generous, though it was really his attorneys who spun the deal. She got the house in the Green Meadow suburbs, a cushy alimony. What more could she possibly need? Nearly 40 now, she had become invisible in the city's elite circles. She had never truly played the part of socialite. In his mind, she had faded into a comfortable beige haze of gardening and book clubs. It was a comforting thought. "Vincent, good to see you," boomed Gregory Wells, slapping a hand on Vincent's back. Gregory was old money, legacy wealth. A man whose approval Vincent still quietly coveted. "Gregory, you're looking sharp," Vincent said with polished ease. "I take it the market's been kind?" They fell into their usual dance of power pleasantries, smooth boasts wrapped in practiced humility, mutual curiosity masked as small talk. Vincent was in his zone, confident, slick, effortless. Delilah soon reappeared, latching onto his arm with the practiced poise of someone who knew her role. "And this must be the lovely Delilah," Gregory said, giving her a subtle once-over. "Delighted to finally meet you." Delilah beamed. "Vincent talks about you all the time. Your instincts are legendary." Vincent flinched ever so slightly at the sound of Vincent turning into Vinny. Juvenile, clumsy. Amelia had always called him Vincent, never anything less. "Well, Vincent, you've certainly done well for yourself," Gregory said, glancing back at him with an unreadable flicker in his gaze. "Though I must admit, I always had a soft spot for Amelia. Class act, that woman. How's she doing these days?" The question landed like a trap. Vincent forced a breezy smile. "Amelia? Oh, she's fine, doing well." He waved a hand dismissively, like brushing away a dull memory. "You know her. Content with the quiet life. I doubt events like this are her scene anymore." "A shame," Gregory murmured, his attention drifting toward the towering entrance of the ballroom. "She had one of the sharpest minds I've come across. Her insight when she served on the Urban Culture Board, absolutely invaluable." A familiar pang rippled through Vincent. Resentment. People always said that about Amelia. They admired her intellect, her calm, her unshakable presence. For years he took that as praise by association, proof of his own good judgment. But gradually, it had begun to feel like competition. And he was losing. She had a glow all her own, and he had wanted to be the only star in their sky. That glow had once illuminated the corners of his life, but now it cast a shadow on his pride, on his ego, on his new beginning. "She's focused on other things now," he said quickly, itching to pivot. "Anyway, about that tech fund." But Gregory wasn't listening. His attention, along with that of nearly everyone within earshot, had shifted. A hush was sweeping the ballroom, quiet as snowfall, but spreading fast. Heads turned in unison, a ripple of silence emanating from the grand entrance. Vincent followed their gaze, annoyed by the distraction. A latecomer? It couldn't possibly justify this much attention. A senator? Some visiting royalty? The crowd near the entrance slowly parted, reverent and curious, like the sea bowing to an invisible force. And then, through the gap, she appeared. At first, Vincent's mind refused to compute what his eyes were telling him. It was a woman. But even that word felt inadequate. She didn't walk, she glided, a vision carved from mystery and confidence. She wore a gown of midnight silk that seemed to absorb every light in the room, flowing like liquid ink around her frame. The cut was daringly simple, yet undeniably elite, couture at its finest, clinging to curves Vincent never even remembered. At her collarbone rested a diamond necklace that made the one on Delilah's neck look like a trinket from a mall boutique. Her hair, no longer the sensible, shoulder-length style she used to wear, was swept into an intricate, elegant updo that revealed the graceful line of her neck. It was regal, commanding, a statement of reinvention spoken without a single word. But it was her face that stunned him. Familiar, yes, but the expression, that was entirely new. The meek, self-conscious woman Vincent had once left behind no longer existed. In her place stood someone transformed, radiant, powerful, and impossibly self-assured. Her makeup was refined, sculpting high cheekbones he had somehow forgotten, and her eyes, those same eyes that used to look at him with warmth, now shimmered with secrets he would never be allowed to learn. And she was smiling, not the soft, agreeable smile he remembered, but a subtle, knowing curve of the lips, the smile of a woman who understood her worth and no longer needed validation. Delilah, sensing the sudden shift in the room's energy, leaned closer and whispered, "Who is that? She looks like a movie star." Vincent couldn't respond. He couldn't move. His champagne glass suddenly felt like a brick in his limp hand. Everything, the opulent ballroom, the weighty crowd of CEOs and senators, the glittering chandeliers, blurred into insignificance. Because he knew exactly who she was. As the woman in the midnight gown took another step into the room, a collective intake of breath spread like a chain reaction. Eyes widened, heads turned, whispers caught like sparks in dry grass. "Is that? My God, it can't be. Amelia Aldridge?" And with that name, his name, once hers, rippling through the air like a bell toll, Vincent felt a chill claw up the back of his neck. This wasn't the quiet, demure ex-wife he had mentally tucked away in suburbia. This was someone else. A revelation. A reckoning. This was Amelia. And she had just stepped back into his world. Amelia could feel the weight of their stares clinging to her like velvet. Every gaze brushed her skin, deliberate and stunned. It didn't rattle her. Not anymore. She had spent years piecing herself back together in the shadows, learning to walk tall again in rooms that once made her feel small. 6 months ago, the attention would have shredded her nerves. She would have crumbled, breath shallow, eyes downcast, begging to disappear. But tonight she fed on it. The shock, the awe, the disbelief, it all flowed through her like electricity, igniting something long dormant and fiercely alive. She had envisioned this moment endlessly, rehearsed it until her fear dulled into a polished resolve. The walk from the town car to the ballroom had been the longest of her life. Her silk-gloved fingers had trembled as she gave her name at the check-in. The woman behind the desk had blinked in shock, the first tremor of the social earthquake now erupting inside the room. She stood on the edge of the life she had once known, poised between who she had been and who she had become. Amelia paused, a deliberate, strategic stillness. She let them look, let them fully absorb the transformation. The Amelia they remembered had mastered invisibility. She wore quiet shades, sensible pumps, and carried herself with the calm, dull restraint of someone who had long accepted being background to her own story. She had been Mrs. Vincent Aldridge, a title, not an identity, but the woman standing before them now was an act of rebellion wrapped in silk. The midnight blue gown, a custom creation by rising designer Julian Damaris, was a declaration. Elegant, daring, fiercely feminine. The thigh-high slit revealed nothing unless she moved, and when she did, it teased just enough to leave a trail of whispers. The diamond necklace, the glimmering constellation resting against her collarbone, was not a hand-me-down from a man. It wasn't history wrapped around her throat. It was power she'd chosen for herself. Loaned by a luxury jeweler through a mutual connection, it sparkled like a crown she didn't inherit, she earned. But the real transformation went beyond the surface. It was in the proud lift of her chin, the firm line of her shoulders, the ease with which she moved. The past 6 months had been brutal, stripping everything, then slowly rebuilding. There were nights she couldn't sleep, when the silence screamed reminders of every moment she had been made to feel small. There were mornings she stood frozen in front of her closet, paralyzed by the weight of reinvention. And yet, she chose to keep going, inch by inch, layer by painful layer. She'd hired a trainer, not to impress, but to reclaim strength. She'd met with a stylist, not to blend in, but to define what made her feel magnetic. And in the privacy of long therapy sessions, she had done the deeper work, unearthing the version of herself long buried under Vincent's offhand cruelty and unspoken contempt. Then she saw him. Across a sea of stunned faces, there he stood. Vincent, next to the redhead from tabloid snapshots. Delilah looked like a budget version of what Amelia now effortlessly embodied. But it was Vincent's face that held her attention. The slack-jawed shock, the quick flicker of disbelief, the tightening rage fighting to surface. It was everything she had once feared. And now, everything she had mastered. She had imagined this moment 100 ways. None had been as satisfying as reality. A slow, genuine smile tugged at her lips. And then she stepped forward. With that, the spell shattered. The quiet hum of speculation exploded into full-volume astonishment. Is that Amelia Aldridge? No way. She's transformed. She looks spectacular. Vincent must be choking on his scotch. That last comment came from Beatrice Harlow, the city's most notorious gossip columnist, her eyes glinting with unfiltered glee. This was no longer just a gala, it was a spectacle, and Amelia was the story. She moved through the sea of guests with fluid grace, a calm smile resting on her lips. Faces she had known for years now greeted her with an entirely different energy. Women who once offered her nothing more than pity now looked at her with a potent mix of awe and quiet jealousy. Men who had barely registered her existence before now stumbled over their own words to catch her attention. "Amelia, darling, you look absolutely divine," gushed a woman whose name Amelia couldn't quite place. "Thank you, Clarissa," Amelia replied, her voice warm but controlled. She had made it a point to remember the names of those who had treated her with kindness, and just as purposefully forgotten the ones who had followed Vincent's dismissive lead. Every glance that lingered, every compliment tinged with disbelief, was a thread in the tapestry of her quiet retribution. She didn't need revenge. This, her mere presence, was enough. She was drifting toward the bar when a man stepped into her path, his presence quiet but unmistakable. He was tall, with sharp, rugged features that cut through the sea of overly polished men. His eyes, dark and keen, held a flicker of amusement, as if he were watching a play, only he fully understood. "I hope you'll forgive the interruption," he said, his voice a rich baritone that seemed to settle into her bones. "But your entrance was the most captivating thing I've witnessed all year." "My name is Julian Croft." Amelia's breath caught. The name was instantly familiar. Julian Croft, the enigmatic tech mogul whose fortune was entirely self-made, brilliant, private, the very definition of unreachable. He was known for avoiding these social showcases like the plague. "Amelia Aldridge," she replied, extending a gloved hand with quiet elegance. His grip was warm, steady, no affected flourish, no dramatic kiss on the hand, just a grounded, respectful hold. His gaze never wavered from hers. "I know who you are, Miss Aldridge, or is it Miss now?" "Miss," she confirmed, a flicker of satisfaction warming her chest at the way he'd phrased it. "And please, call me Amelia." "Amelia," he repeated, rolling it softly across his tongue as if tasting its shape. "It suits you far better than the murmurs I've heard tonight." "And what murmurs are those, Mr. Croft?" "That you'd vanished," he said lightly. "Seems the rumors of your disappearance were greatly exaggerated." There was no flirtation in his tone, no predatory glint in his eyes, just a rare, unguarded sincerity. It was disarming in the gentlest way. His smile was sincere, charming in its simplicity, and for the first time that night, Amelia felt the tension in her shoulders ease. Across the room, Vincent watched the exchange, his jaw tight. Who the hell was that man? Whoever he was standing far too close to Amelia, talking too comfortably. And she was smiling. Not the polite kind she used to reserve for strangers. No, this was something else. "Not yours anymore," a cruel voice in his head reminded him. But the instinct to claim was still there, clawing its way up his spine. It was the kind of effortless, intimate connection Thomas hadn't felt with Eleanor in years. "Tommy, who was she even talking to?" Camille's voice cut through his red-tinted fury, shrill and grating. "And why is everyone staring at her? It's just your plain ex-wife. So she found a new stylist." "Big deal." "Shut up, Camille," Thomas snapped, his voice a sharp, low hiss. Camille recoiled, her eyes filling with tears. "Don't talk to me like that." But Thomas wasn't listening anymore. He was fixated on Eleanor and Cole Whitman. He watched as Cole threw his head back with a genuine laugh, rich and unguarded, and Eleanor leaned in, her eyes bright. He watched as Cole motioned toward the bar, extending his arm. And he watched as Eleanor slipped her hand, gloved and graceful, around his elbow. They walked away together, moving through the crowd like it didn't exist, like they were in orbit around each other. The sight struck Thomas like a blow to the chest. He had written the story in his mind. He was the one who had escaped the monotony, the one who'd traded beige predictability for fire and thrill. Eleanor was supposed to be the sad one, the overlooked, the outdated, the ex-wife left behind. But the woman in that sapphire gown wasn't sad. She was radiant. And her radiance, he realized with a jolt of nauseating clarity, made his narrative crumble. She wasn't the one who had lost. He was. "Thomas, that's really her?" came a voice beside him. Jonathan Ellis had returned, champagne flute in hand, but his eyes were fixed on Eleanor. "My God," he breathed. "She's stunning." The word lingered in the air between them like a gavel falling in a courtroom. Stunning. It was the last word Thomas Caldwell ever wanted to hear, associated with the woman he had discarded. The gala, meant to be his grand moment, was morphing into a nightmare. And deep down, he knew the night wasn't over. Cole's conversation felt like cool water after a decade wandering a desert. He didn't mention her past, didn't poke or pry, didn't gawk like she was some returned ghost. He talked about sculpture in Florence, a last-minute trip to Kyoto, the absurdity of tiny hors d'oeuvres served on even tinier spoons. He was witty, wry, and when Eleanor spoke, he actually listened, really listened. "So what's your story, Eleanor Quinn?" he asked as they stepped into a quieter corner near the terrace, away from the buzz and stares. And I don't mean the one everyone here is making up in their heads. She took a slow sip of the champagne he had handed her. It tasted like triumph. I'm a woman who decided to read a different book, she said simply. Cole's eyes crinkled with amusement. I like that. Most people here just reread the same page over and over. So you're a writer? Editor? No, she smiled, soft but certain. Just a connoisseur of new chapters. The confidence tasted strange, thrilling, even, on Eleanor's tongue. 6 months ago, she would have mumbled something vague about being a mother, maybe mentioned her former seat on a non-profit board. But tonight, she was the centerpiece. Their easy laughter and undeniable chemistry did not go unnoticed. Across the room, columnist Veronica Bloom was scribbling madly into her leather-bound notepad. Camille, draped in crimson silk and pride, was glaring daggers from near the bar. Her face was a portrait of shocked fury, but the most scorching stare came from Thomas. His eyes never left them, locked on Eleanor and Cole like a hawk tracking prey. His jaw was tight, his grip on his whiskey glass so hard his knuckles blanched. He couldn't take it. He needed to reclaim control, to put her back in the shadow where he had left her. Excusing himself from a sniffling Camille, he stormed across the ballroom. The crowd sensed the shift in the air and parted for him instinctively. He reached Eleanor and Cole just as Cole was animatedly describing a calamitous sailing trip near the Amalfi. Eleanor, Thomas said, his voice clipped and brittle. He didn't so much as glance at Cole, like the man was an inconvenient lamp. I need a word. Eleanor turned to him slowly, her expression all polite curiosity, as though a stranger had asked her for the nearest restroom. Thomas, I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of a conversation. The dismissal, cool, direct, and devastating, knocked the air from his lungs. This will only take a moment. I'm sure it will, she replied, her voice maddeningly serene. But as you can see, I'm otherwise engaged. And then, she turned her back to him. Just like that, it hit like a slap. She flashed Cole a brilliant smile. So you were saying something about a rogue wave in your captain's hat? To his credit, Cole didn't miss a beat, picking up the story with a spark of mischief in his eyes. The message was clear to everyone nearby. Thomas Caldwell had no dominion here. Humiliation surged through him, bitter and searing. He had always been the man others deferred to, the voice everyone listened for. To be dismissed by her, in public, beside him, was unthinkable. He stood there for a beat too long, flailing silently before stalking off, his vision narrowed by rage. And directly into the path of a furious Camille. What the hell was that? She spat, voice shaking with fury and embarrassment. She just turned her back on you. Are you seriously letting her get away with that? And who is he? It doesn't matter who he is, Thomas snarled, gripping her arm harder than he meant to. It's a pathetic ploy to make me jealous. That's all. Jealous? Camille scoffed, a brittle, high-pitched laugh. She's making you look like a damn fool, Tommy. Everyone's talking about it, Camille hissed. They're laughing, at you, at us. The accusation struck a nerve raw and deep. Don't be ridiculous, Thomas muttered, brushing it off with a wave. But as his gaze swept the ballroom, he saw the truth in her words. The murmurs hadn't died down, they'd simply shifted. The shock had settled into something worse, amusement. There was a gleeful cruelty in the air now, the kind reserved for the downfall of kings. He caught smirks on the lips of former rivals, saw the glint of satisfaction in their narrowed eyes. Even his allies wore a sheen of pity. Thomas Caldwell, architect of empires, orchestrator of prestige, had become the evening's punchline, and the gala he had once envisioned as his crowning moment now felt like a stage for public ridicule. At the center of it all was Eleanor. It had to be. That entire entrance, the composure, the deliberate elegance, it was all a calculated act meant to gut him. He thought back to their marriage, to all the times he had made her feel small, told himself it was for the sake of balance. He was the headline, she was the byline. He was the main act, she was supporting cast. One memory surged to the front, 2 years before the split. He'd been in the running for a board seat at Harrington Holdings. The final decision was between him and one other partner. George Patel, the CEO, had hosted a private dinner for the contenders and their spouses. Eleanor had been seated next to Patel, and she had done what she always did, made an impression. They'd spoken about sculpture, minimalism, and the Rothko exhibit. Eleanor had visited twice alone because Thomas had deemed it colorful nonsense. The next morning, Patel had called. Your wife is extraordinary, Thomas. Seriously bright. Her thoughts on adaptive space in modern installations? Eye-opening. You're a fortunate man. Thomas had gotten the promotion, but the compliment had left a bitter taste. It felt tainted, as though he'd climbed on her shoulders to reach the top. That night, he had lashed out. Don't let last night get to your head, he'd sneered. George was being polite. Stick to what you're good at. Menus, table settings, and looking pretty. Leave the real thinking to people who get paid for it. She had flinched, her eyes flickering with pain. And back then, he'd taken satisfaction in that reaction. It meant she remembered her place. But now, watching her across the room, glowing, vibrant, unmistakably alive, he saw the truth. He hadn't been putting her in her place. He'd been trying to snuff out her light because he feared it might shine brighter than his. The rage inside him had no safe outlet, and Camille stood too close. This is your fault, he growled, eyes dark. Turning on me? That ridiculous dress. You look like a Christmas ornament, Thomas snapped, his voice low and biting. My fault? Camille screeched, drawing even more unwanted attention. Her voice bounced off the marble columns and chandeliers. You're the one whose ex-wife just strolled in looking like she belongs on a Vogue cover, and now you're blaming my dress? She flung a trembling hand toward Eleanor. Do something. Don't just stand here and let her win. It's not a competition, he insisted. But even as he said it, Thomas felt the icy truth slice through him. It was, and he was losing. Meanwhile, Eleanor was learning things. Cole Whitman, as it turned out, wasn't just witty and well-traveled. He was also a board member of the Children's Horizon Foundation, a significant donor no less, though he usually sent a representative to these galas. What made you come in person this year? Eleanor asked, her curiosity piqued. Cole met her gaze, unwavering. I heard a rumor the board was about to welcome a very dynamic new member. I wanted to meet her. He paused, his lips curving into a quiet smile. I believe her name is Eleanor Quinn. For a moment, Eleanor's carefully composed exterior nearly faltered. You knew? I may have played a small role in your nomination, he admitted. I sit on the selection committee. When your name came up, I remembered Jonathan Ellis mentioning you months ago. I did my homework. He shifted slightly, voice dipping into something softer. A woman who turned the Modern Arts Museum's sinking budget around with pure strategy, who speaks 3 languages, who holds a degree in art history from the Sorbonne. He looked at her, almost reverently. You weren't just qualified, Eleanor. You were the secret weapon they didn't know they needed. The validation hit her like a wave. Unbidden, a sting gathered behind her eyes. She blinked, hard. She wouldn't cry. Not tonight. Thomas never even mentioned my work at the museum, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Cole leaned closer, his tone low and personal. I'm beginning to think, there's a lot about you Thomas Caldwell never took the time to understand. The warmth in his gaze felt like sunlight on frost. It soothed something inside her she hadn't even realized was still hurting. That was the moment Eleanor knew. Her transformation was complete. It had never been about the gown or the necklace or the stairs. It was about this, being seen. Truly seen. But the night was just beginning. The centerpiece of the gala, the high-stakes charity auction, was moments away. This was no ordinary fundraiser. It was a spectacle, a performance, where fortunes were displayed like trophies and pride was dressed up as philanthropy. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a tux with a showman's grin, stepped onto the stage. A hush rippled through the ballroom, and Thomas Caldwell, who had built a reputation at these events with his ruthless, attention-grabbing bids, felt something shift inside him. This was his arena, and he was ready for war. This was his chance to reclaim the narrative. The first few items, a week at a vineyard estate in Napa, a rare set of Bordeaux vintages, sold for the usual eye-watering sums. Thomas made a point of winning a particularly coveted prize, a private dinner with a Michelin-starred chef. He bid far above its actual worth just to make a statement. He cast a triumphant look in Eleanor's direction. She wasn't even watching. She was deep in conversation with Cole Whitman, their heads bent together as they flipped through the auction catalog, their focus entirely on each other. Something about their closeness, the ease, the shared smiles, gnawed at the edge of Thomas's pride. Eleanor had never leaned in like that with him, not even in their so-called best years. Then came the final item, the crown jewel of the night. It was a breathtaking abstract piece by a world-renowned contemporary artist. Phoenix Ascendant had been the buzz of every gallery circuit for months. "We'll begin the bidding for Phoenix Ascendant at $100,000, the auctioneer called. A paddle rose immediately. "Cole Whitman's, $200,000, he said, his tone calm and assured. Thomas's head jerked toward him. Cole? Since when did he collect art? Thomas had always seen himself as the tastemaker, the cultural elite. Cole, in his mind, was silicon chips and server farms. Another paddle rose, then another. The bidding escalated rapidly, a back-and-forth blur between the city's most powerful collectors. Thomas held back, waiting. He'd seen this play out before. Let the competition burn themselves out, then swoop in at the end. A classic Caldwell move. The number hit $450,000. The room quieted, breath held. $450 going once, the auctioneer began. Thomas raised his paddle. $500,000, he declared, his voice booming. A murmur of approval rippled through the ballroom. This was Thomas Caldwell, the alpha among titans. One bidder bowed out. The other hesitated, then lowered his paddle with a reluctant shake of the head. 500 going once, going twice. All eyes turned to Cole, who hadn't moved since his first bid. He simply smiled and gave the faintest shake of his head. Victory. It surged through Thomas like a hit of champagne. He'd done it. He had won. He turned to Eleanor, smug satisfaction curving his lips. And then it happened. A new paddle rose, high and unmistakable. It was held by a hand clad in midnight blue silk. 600,000, Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was calm, crisp, measured confidence that didn't seek permission. She wasn't just raising a paddle. She was raising the stakes. It cut through the room like crystal through still water. The air changed. A collective gasp swept the ballroom as every gaze turned from Thomas to Eleanor and back again. This wasn't just an auction now. It was a reckoning. Thomas was stunned. What the hell was she doing? She couldn't afford this. Yes, her divorce settlement had been generous, but not bid on a masterwork of modern art generous. This had to be a bluff. A performance. She was trying to drive up the price, force him to overpay, humiliate him. Rage, pure, searing rage, coursed through him. He would not be manipulated. He raised his paddle again, his hand trembling slightly. $700,000. Eleanor didn't even flinch. 8, she said, her voice cool, effortless. She didn't need to raise her tone. The quiet confidence, the unshaken poise, that's what rattled him most. This wasn't just a power play. This was precision. Camille clutched at his arm, eyes wide with alarm. Tommy, stop, she whispered urgently. What are you doing? It's just a painting. He shook her off without a glance. It was never just a painting, he muttered. It was pride. It was control. It was a battle for the last word, for reminding Eleanor of the box he'd once kept her in. $1 million, Thomas snapped, his voice slicing through the silence. The room gasped. $1 million. At a charity auction. The number hung in the air, weighty and absurd. It was an unhinged move, reckless, driven by ego, not reason. But he couldn't stop himself. He needed to win, even if the victory cost him more than money. Even if it revealed everything he was desperate to hide. He stared across the ballroom at Eleanor, daring her to continue, challenging her. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, not hesitation, something else, something unreadable. She turned to Cole. He gave the faintest nod, and she lowered her paddle. The gentleman has made his point, she said, her voice edged with quiet amusement that hit like ice water. She turned to Cole, unconcerned. Looks like he wanted it more than I did. The gavel struck. Thomas had won. He had the painting, but the taste of victory turned to ash in his mouth. $1 million. For a painting he didn't even particularly like. The applause felt muted, hollow, almost mocking. He had shown his strength, but more importantly, he had shown his weakness. He had shown them all how deeply his ex-wife could still rattle him. Later, as guests mingled before the closing remarks, Thomas cornered Eleanor near the terrace. The rage he had kept barely contained all night was beginning to overflow. What the hell was that? He snapped, voice low and venomous. That was childish, a pathetic stunt. Eleanor, you knew you couldn't afford that painting, Thomas hissed. You did it just to make me look like a fool. She turned to him slowly, and for the first time in years, he saw something behind her eyes. something sharp and untamed that he had thought long extinguished. "You're wrong, Thomas," she said, her voice like ice cracking across a frozen lake. "I wasn't trying to make you look like a fool. You managed that perfectly well all on your own." He scoffed. "My character?" "Yes," she said, stepping closer, her gaze leveled and burning. "The kind of man who's so fragile, he'd rather torch $1 million than let himself lose to the woman he once discarded. The kind of man who can't stand watching me breathe freely without feeling the need to reassert control." Her words landed like arrows. "You didn't see me as a wife, Thomas. You saw me as a trophy, and now you can't handle the fact that your trophy learned how to walk away." Each syllable carved through his ego with surgical precision. "And as for affording it," she continued, her lips curving into a calm, deadly smile, "you seem to have forgotten the inheritance my grandmother left me, the one I never touched because you said we didn't need it, because you would provide." She paused, letting it land. "Apparently, my quiet little life had a few secrets you weren't entitled to." She tilted her head slightly, her voice turning almost conversational. "Oh, and the artist, Jean-Paul Dubois? He's an old friend from my time at the Sorbonne. He donated the painting on one condition, that I be the one to present it." She let the silence settle for half a second longer before delivering the final blow. "The bidding war? Just performance. Performance art, really. Every cent goes to the Children's Foundation." She smiled, soft and stunning. "Your $1 million will do so much good." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. He had been outplayed, masterfully. He hadn't won. He'd been used. To raise the price, to fund a cause she championed, to stand there and pay for her triumph with his pride. "You," he stammered, but the rage and humiliation caught in his throat. "Me," she said simply. Then she looked past him, toward Cole, who was watching with quiet admiration from across the room. "And now, if you'll excuse me," she added, "the Foundation's newest board member has a speech to give." She turned and walked away, each step measured, effortless, radiant. He stood there, alone. His $1 million win now felt like a fool's crown on his head. He was Thomas Caldwell. He never lost. But as the ballroom erupted in applause and Eleanor took the stage, the diamond at her throat catching the light like a blade, he knew, without doubt, without escape. He hadn't just lost the night. He had lost the war. The stage lights seemed to awaken with intent, as if they recognized a shift in power, and turned, almost reverently, to bathe Eleanor in a halo of golden warmth. Under their spotlight, the deep midnight of her gown turned inky and endless, like the heart of a vast ocean. The diamond pendant at her collar scattered light like a prism, casting tiny dancing rainbows across her skin. She didn't just look elegant, she looked ordained, calm, commanding, entirely composed. She was the still axis around which the grand ballroom spun. The applause that greeted her wasn't the restrained clapping reserved for donors or board speeches. It erupted. A surge of raw, genuine energy from a room that sensed it was witnessing something rare, something definitive. It wasn't applause, it was a verdict. Thomas stood motionless in the crowd, invisible inside the spectacle he had so carefully curated for himself. The champagne in his hand had gone flat, lukewarm, lifeless. Camille, now a splash of angry red in his fading periphery, had drifted away to a corner of socialites, who now looked at him with expressions both piteous and vulturine. He felt the room recalibrate around her. This woman he thought he had known, this woman he once dismissed as ornamental. She was no longer standing in his shadow. She was the light. He was alone. Utterly, breathtakingly alone, in a room he once commanded, a fading island in a glittering tide. And that tide was pulling away fast, revealing the sharp, humiliating rock of his ruin for all to see. Then Eleanor spoke. Her voice, now magnified by the microphone, didn't lose a single drop of its warmth. It rang clear, composed, unshakable. "Good evening." The room fell utterly silent. "For 15 years, she said, I attended this gala on the arm of a powerful man." A few chuckles, uncomfortable, knowing, rippled through the crowd. "I wore beautiful dresses, I smiled at the right people, I wrote checks, and I believed that was the extent of my ability to contribute." She let that linger, her eyes moving slowly across the ballroom. "I was a passenger in my own life." Then, her gaze met his, just for a moment. And in that single, aching second, Thomas saw something in her he couldn't fight. Not triumph, not vengeance. Clarity, a quiet, piercing truth. She saw him, all of him, and found him lacking. It was a look that stripped him bare. "It's easy to become a passenger," she continued, her voice softer now, pulling every soul in the room closer. "It's comfortable, it's quiet, you let someone else drive, hold the map, choose the direction, and slowly you forget the power in your own 2 feet, the strength in your own voice. You forget," Eleanor continued, her voice steady and expansive, "that you even have a choice." A hush fell over the ballroom. Listening became something physical. But then one day the car stops, and you find yourself on the side of the road, alone. The dust is still settling around you, and in that silence, you realize you have a decision to make. She let the pause linger just long enough. You can wait for another car, hope it's headed your way. Or, she breathed in, calm and certain, you can start walking. A murmur swept through the room, soft, resonant. This was no longer a speech. It was a confession, a sermon, a liberation. It echoed in the hearts of the woman whose husband always made the choices, the man who lived the life his father mapped out, the artist who traded canvas for cubicle. Every soul in the room, in some forgotten part of themselves, knew what it meant to be the abandoned passenger. "I started walking," Eleanor said. And now there was strength in her words, a new, undeniable gravity. Her voice, once conditioned to pause for approval, now moved with the force of certainty. The kind of certainty born only from fire and solitude. "And I discovered something. I discovered that my own 2 feet were stronger than I ever imagined. That my voice, once I chose to use it, could fill rooms." She smiled gently. "I discovered that the destination I chose for myself was more vibrant, more fulfilling, more real than any place I'd ever been taken to." Then her eyes found Cole. He was leaning against a marble column, arms folded, a look of open admiration in his eyes. He smiled at her, soft, proud, just for her. "And most importantly," Eleanor said, her voice threading to its quietest strength, "I discovered I wasn't walking alone." A pause. Then her tone lifted again, glowing with pride. "This foundation, which means so much to me, has raised a record-breaking amount of money tonight." The crowd responded with an anticipatory stir. And it's thanks, in no small part, to the generous if rather dramatic contribution of Mr. Thomas Caldwell. Laughter erupted. Real, joyful, cathartic laughter. Not cruel, just honest. The kind of laughter reserved for poetic justice. It swept through the room like a cleansing tide, washing away pretense and polishing the truth until it gleamed. Thomas felt heat creep up his neck, scorching, unstoppable. She had thanked him and dismantled him in the same breath. She had taken his pride, his ego, his blunder, and reframed it as her moment. She had turned his reckless flex into a story of generosity she authored. She was building her future with the rubble of his collapse. Eleanor allowed just the faintest smile. "The $1 million winning bid for Phoenix Ascendant, rather aptly named, don't you think?" she added with gentle grace, "will allow us to break ground on something we've dreamed of for years." She looked out across the crowd, radiant. "It will fully fund the construction of a new, state-of-the-art wing for the Children's Hospital." The applause was instant and thunderous. It was the sound of something being rewritten, not just a legacy, but a life. And as Eleanor stood under the warm light, the room rising to its feet, Thomas Caldwell stood among the glittering ruins of his own mythology. And he knew. She hadn't just risen, she had soared. Now, as a testament to the scale of the donation, Thomas felt a wave of nausea so intense he had to grip the back of a nearby chair just to remain upright. His name, his money, his theatrical act of public dominance, all of it had been commandeered. "And so," Eleanor said, her voice ringing with unmistakable finality, "I'm thrilled and deeply honored to announce that the new wing will be named the Caldwell Wing." Checkmate. The move was devastating in its elegance, strategic in its cruelty, complete in its execution. And somewhere, beneath the shock, a small part of him, perhaps the only honest part, couldn't help but marvel at the brilliance of it. Hundreds of eyes turned to him, expecting pride, gratitude, dignity. He gave them nothing. He couldn't. He was trapped in the full weight of the irony. His name would now be etched into the facade of a building he'd never wanted, a place where every brick, every engraved letter would stand not as a monument to his legacy, but to her triumph. She hadn't just outplayed him. She had rewritten the narrative and branded it with his name. The The same name he had once used to assert control, now repurposed as a symbol of her strength and his downfall. Eleanor closed her speech with a graceful call to action, her voice earnest and stirring. But Thomas heard none of it. He was lost in the roaring vacuum of his own unraveling. When she stepped down, the ballroom rose in a tidal wave of applause. Not for Mrs. Thomas Caldwell, the well-dressed accessory at his side for over a decade, but for Eleanor Quinn, the woman who had risen from the wreckage, the woman who had forged her own wings from the very flames meant to destroy her. She descended the stage into a sea of admiration. Jonathan Ellis reached her first, his face alight. "Eleanor," he said, taking her hands in his. "That was masterful. Your mother always said you had a steel spine. She would be so proud of you tonight." At the edge of the crowd stood Cole. He hadn't pushed through. He didn't need to. He simply waited, anchored and still. And when Eleanor finally reached him, he said nothing. He just offered her his arm, and she, without hesitation, took it. Together they walked out through the towering glass doors, into the hush of the terrace, away from the noise, into the cool, quiet promise of night. Thomas finally moved, limbs leaden and foreign. He drifted out of the ballroom in a daze. He didn't look for Camille. He didn't need to. He already knew what he'd find. The cold, bitter echo of calculation. The trophy had witnessed the fall of the champion. And with that fall, her loyalty, always more transaction than devotion, began to dissolve in real time. It had been a contract, unspoken but rigid. Prestige in exchange for proximity to power. And Thomas had just violated its most sacred clause, invincibility. He stepped out into the valet circle. The night air hit him like a blade, slicing through the stifling fog of champagne, humiliation, and too much heat. He felt gutted, hollow, undone. And then he saw them. Eleanor and Cole, standing by a sleek black sedan, its engine idling with the quiet confidence of something that always gets what it wants. Cole held the door open for her, posture easy, effortless. Before Eleanor stepped inside, she paused. She turned, as if sensing him across the polished concrete and fleet of luxury vehicles. Their eyes met, and in that moment Thomas searched her face, desperately, for something familiar. Fury, bitterness, some small, smug satisfaction, anything he could rise to. But he found none of it. Instead, he saw something far more lethal. Indifference. Complete, serene, unmovable indifference. She no longer saw him as an antagonist, or a ghost, or even a memory. He wasn't part of her story anymore. Not a villain, not a mistake, just irrelevant, a footnote. The once sacred narrative of Thomas and Eleanor was done. This was the beginning of Eleanor's story. She gave him a final nod. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't peace, it was dismissal, final, complete, irrevocable. Then she slipped into the car, graceful, composed, unshaken. A queen departing a battlefield she had conquered not with force, but with clarity, conviction, and self-worth. The car pulled away, its taillights fading into the jeweled maze of the city. And Thomas Caldwell was left standing in the dark. Not just without a wife, not just $1 million poorer, but stripped of something far greater. The best part of himself, the part he had never taken the time to know. He had traded a rare, luminous diamond for a mirror that merely reflected his own vanity, and he hadn't even realized the loss until he saw the diamond shining in someone else's light. He stood alone now, in the echo of applause that had never belonged to him, tasting the metallic sting of $1 million mistake, a king in a gilded cage, and for the first time, with soul-cracking clarity, he understood. The door had always been open. He had simply been too blind, too proud, too in love with the reflection in the bars to ever walk out. And that is how a woman once dismissed as quiet and ordinary showed an entire city that the most stunning transformations don't come from a new dress, or even a new man. They come from something deeper, quieter, unshakable, the discovery of your own worth. Eleanor Quinn's story wasn't one of revenge. This wasn't just a victory. It was reclamation. It was about taking back the pen, writing her story in her own voice, on her own terms. Eleanor didn't just win the night. She reclaimed her life. And in doing so, she created a legend. So the story is over. Our wonderful friends, are you still here at this hour? If you are, then maybe, just maybe, something in this story touched your heart. Maybe you saw a part of yourself in Eleanor, or in the silence she once lived in, or in the voice she finally found. You see, this wasn't just about a gala or a dress or revenge. It was about reclamation. It was about what happens when someone who's been silenced finally decides to speak, and does so not with bitterness, but with clarity. There's a quote by Carl Jung that says, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." That's the spirit of this story. Eleanor didn't win because she looked beautiful or made someone else look foolish. She won because she remembered her value and acted on it. And maybe that's the message for us tonight. We all have chapters we wish we could rewrite. We all carry the echo of someone who tried to reduce our worth. But the truth is, we are never trapped in the version of us someone else created. We can rise. We can rewrite. We can reclaim. So if you're standing at the edge of your own story, wondering if it's too late to begin again, know this: it never is. The pen is still in your hand. If this story moved you even just a little, if it whispered something into your soul tonight, please like, share, and subscribe, not for us, but for you. For the part of you that needs to be reminded. You are not invisible, you are not small, you are not forgotten, you are becoming, and you're doing it beautifully. Thank you for being here. Let's keep telling stories that heal. Good night.